Hello, this is Brett Miller, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about three really cool things that will help really explode your view of the way that you read your New Testament. There are three things that we want to talk about. The first is this idea of empire versus kingdom. Rome versus the kingdom of God. The kingdom of the Caesars versus the kingdom of the Christ. And that's a very exciting topic, and there's a lot of political intrigue and a lot of interplay between the structures of power and the structures of honor and shame that are built into the idea of empire. And for a world where Caesar was worshipped as a living god, that's an important backdrop to understand when we read our New Testament. A second very important consideration is the idea of honor and shame. And that's closely tied with the ideas of kingdom and empire. But the honor-shame culture is shared by both Judaism and Rome. And this is the whole idea that there were behaviors and actions and things that led to a person having a position of status and honor and the associated wealth and respect and access to powers and halls of power that came with that, versus shameful conduct, conduct that brought reproach, conduct that limited your ability to traffic in the business of empire or to have access to the halls of power or to have access even to God or the gods. So honor and shame is deeply woven into this culture. And the third very important criteria that we're going to talk about today is the issue of purity and pollution. Sometimes we talk about that as clean or unclean, but this again is something that was shared by both Romans and the Jews, right? Both the Semitic peoples as well as the Gentile peoples, that they all had ideas about what was appropriate, what you could do in certain spaces, what was appropriate behavior in public versus private. Laws around food and sex and toilet were very much a part of this conversation. And so we're going to take a closer look at all three of those areas today, and I hope that you'll find this exciting and enlightening, but that especially it will enhance your ability to see the New Testament really jump right off the page at you. Thanks for participating and thanks for listening. So the first thing we wanted to discuss today was the historical background of what I'm just calling empire versus kingdom. The Roman Empire ruled the world at the time of Christ. They were the world's superpower. And because they were the world's superpower, that created a dominant culture, a way of thinking about politics and individuals, a way of thinking about government and civic duty and responsibility, and especially a way of thinking about leadership and security. And all those things were put in the hands of the Caesars. They were put in the hands of the Roman government. And because that was true, there was this huge push in the overall culture to venerate, to exalt the Caesars, to praise Rome, to want Rome to win. And the phrase Roma Victor was common. Rome will conquer all, or eternal Rome. These kinds of phrases were very, very common in the empire. And much like today, if you live in the American West, or here in the Western world, what we call the minority world now, we get a lot of our cultural influence from the fact that our country behaves in certain ways, has certain expectations of us, and provides protections and provides a financial safety net. And we're really experiencing that at this current moment. We have a country that can write checks and literally put money in the pocket of hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans. And so there's a dominance in that culture, and there's a desire on our part as Americans to rely on that government, rely on that structure to give us protection and security, and honestly to protect our lifestyle. And so the Romans would have been no exception in that area. And so that culture creates some ways of thinking about rulers, some ways of thinking about being loyal, some ways of expressing honor. So honor and loyalty and rulership were very, very important cultural constructs. And so I want to talk about two scriptures right now that illustrate the way that this was so. So we're going to look at those passages. Then I'm going to give you sort of the enhanced view, the empire perspective. Then we're going to look at those passages again, and I think you'll see that your view of them is substantially enhanced by reading them through the lens of empire. So there was one more thing I wanted to bring up as we talk about emperors and empire, and that is the very prevalent idea of the imperial cult. which really means that the emperors were worshipped as living gods. They were worshipped as divine beings. And I know that that may be a reach for some of us. It's hard for us to imagine a rational people, a highly educated, very advanced culture in many ways, like Rome, subscribing to that belief. Nevertheless, it seems to have been the case. There is ample evidence that this was true, but especially later, under the time of Domitian, once you get into the late 70s, middle 80s, and early 90s, after Christ, this was a very common belief. And so emperor worship impacted everything. It impacted commerce. It impacted the trade guilds. And so it was not uncommon at all to be, if you were a craftsman or a tradesperson, to have to join a trade guild. And these were basically, this is the group of people that buy and sell with you. And those trade guilds would have meetings, and at those meetings, worship was a common thing, and sacrifices to whatever god or goddess was the god or goddess of the trade guild. But very often also, a sacrifice was needed to be made in the name of whatever emperor was currently reigning. And so you see this conflict in the New Testament. This obviously, of course, for the Christian would be anathema, something that they would never, ever agree to do. But later on, in the reign of Domitian, Domitian began to be called by the name Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, was actually his title. And this became his regular title. It's on written correspondence. It was used in conversation. Images dedicated to Domitian littered the Capitol, made of gold and silver. And not only does Domitian appear on an unprecedented quantity of designs of the coins of the time, but oftentimes the deities that appeared on the reverse side of those coins were the ones that were most often associated with world domination. So to follow along here a little bit, think about our common currency. Think about our coins. We have the image, for example, of the president on the front and something like Monticello or a leaf, or there's something on the reverse of our coins, or at the obverse of the coins. And typically you'll have a presidential face on the front, and then on the obverse, on the rear of the coin, something that's associated with America, or something that's associated perhaps with that individual president. What Domitian and some of the emperors began to do was they would put their face on the front of the coin, and on the rear of the coin, they would put the image of Jove or Jupiter, or these gods that were all-powerful, Zeus, these all-powerful creator gods. And the clear indication is, I am a son of this god. I am a son of God. But perhaps the most fascinating and interesting example that I've yet come across is from, again, our friend Domitian. And apparently, when Domitian and his wife Domitia, they had lost a child during the pregnancy. And then he had another son, more or less, as a replacement for that child. And he, of course, when they gave birth to that child, he made many, many sacrifices and made many, many pledges to the gods in gratitude for the birth of his son, who, of course, would have been the heir. So what happens is there are coinages, and we're going to put one up here on the screen, but there are coins that were minted during the time of Domitian that have his name on the front, along with the phrase Dominus et Deus, right? Lord and God. And on the obverse, you have his son, the baby Domitian, standing on the planet Earth, surrounded by 7 stars and holding what's called the fulgum, or the staff of Jupiter, in his hand. And so this is a clear delineation of his son is the son of a god. He's the son of a living God. And that portrayal represents him as being the inheritor of the earth, the ruler of the heavens and the earth. He has the staff in his hand. He's surrounded by 7 stars. And he is portraying his son as the Son of God, who holds the 7 stars at the end of his staff. And if you're thinking of Revelation 1, you're already going where I'm going. You know, when the Apostle John writes in Revelation chapter 1 that one like a son of man comes, and he's standing among the golden lampstands, and in his hand he holds 7 stars. And those stars, of course, turn out to be the angels of the 7 churches in the province of Asia. This is not an accident. This is a clear example of the writer John, the Apostle John, understanding emperor worship, understanding this culture, probably having seen and perhaps even held those coins in his hand. He was well aware of exactly what was being said by Domitian in minting those coins and handing those coins out. And he is turning right back around and saying, no, no, no. Domitian, your son is not a son of God. He is not the Son of God. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the ruler of the kings of the earth. Jesus holds the 7 stars in his hand. Jesus is in charge. He is the King of kings, and he is the Lord of lords. And so I know those passages are familiar to us, but when you again back up and begin to understand the powerful imagery that the empire was pushing out through their coins and through their culture and through their rhetoric, it really makes this passage that John is writing, it's almost humorous. It's so direct. It's so right in their face. And these are the kinds of insights and these are the kinds of exciting things that you can see. And I think the images become so much more powerful and lasting. You're never going to forget this as long as you live. You will always think of little baby Jupiter on the back of that coin every time you read Revelation chapter 1. I know that I do. So I want to combine two things here and show you how a couple of these different concepts can kind of come together and work at the same time. So we've spoken about the empire and how this empire versus kingdom culture was pervasive, and that created so many complications and conflicts for the New Testament Christians. And I know we don't have time to get into all of that today, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a supplemental session that you all can add to your viewing list and watch at another time, where I'll take us through the book of Revelation and talk about some of these things in greater detail. It's an area that I've done a lot of study on, and it's really quite fascinating. But there was one thing I wanted to point out, and I think it's a great illustration of how much the gospel writers and the writers of the epistles were aware of this honor, shame culture, and how much pressure the disciples felt because of empirical Rome and that prevailing dominant outsider culture pushing in on them. So Aristotle, one of the most famous thinkers and philosophers of his day, and of course very influential on Roman and Hellenistic thinking, famously said that when man doesn't live up to the code of honor, when he doesn't act with honor, he is no better than the beasts and the beasts of the field. And so this idea of a dishonorable person being labeled as a beast is actually a common idea even in the New Testament. You know, you look at 2 Peter chapters 2 and 3, and it talks about when man doesn't act in a way that pleases God, he is like a brute beast. He is like a beast that perishes. And so I want you to think about that idea that you have Aristotle challenging his citizenry to act with honor and dignitas and dignity, and saying that when they didn't do that, they were no better than beasts. And so you have this culture of what does it mean to be an honorable Roman, an honorable citizen, and to be a man and to live with honor and dignity, not to be an animal, not to be a beast. So you have that. Then you have emperor worship and the Caesars claiming to be living gods, being venerated and worshipped as gods in temples. Their images were emblazoned on the coinage, and they were associated with gods, and they were worshipped as gods, and they were venerated like that. And so then you get to the book of Revelation, where there is this pronounced theme of the empire of Rome being run not by the Caesars, but as a beast. That the empire that is supposed to be run by living gods, the Caesars, is actually compared again and again and again to the dragon and to the beast. And I cannot overemphasize how much of a sharp stick in the eye that really is to this whole idea of Aristotelian honor and nobility, that even in their most glorious moments, when the Roman emperors were seen to be ruling the world from the church's perspective, from God's perspective, they were unholy kings. They were, in fact, not noble, not honorable, but they were dishonorable. They did dishonorable things. They would receive no honor and no glory. And in fact, everywhere, John calls them the beast. And so to understand just what an assault, just what an affront that would be to a Roman reader, and how encouraging and inspiring and what a great reminder that would be to the Roman Christian to see that in the end, Caesar was nothing and that God was everything. But when you have that sort of cultural view and you understand that it was part and parcel of Roman thinking, this idea of honor and dignity, and how the New Testament writers turn that and they look through the lens the other way and they say, no, this is what is honorable. Following Jesus is honorable. Our king is more honorable than your king, even though it currently appears that your king killed our king. And so through this lens, everything is upside down and yet somehow is so much more clear. A second very important cultural concept is the idea of honor and shame. The Middle East was and still is an honor-shame culture. And we have some experience with that here in the Americas and here in the Western world. It's very embedded in the Hellenistic culture of the time. In fact, Aristotle and Seneca and Isocrates, several of the very major thinkers and writers in Rome at the time also outlined this. And so you come across quotes from Aristotle or quotes from Isocrates. Seneca, who was a first century statesman, was a contemporary of the Apostle Paul and author, wrote this: "The one firm conviction from which we move to the proof of other points is this, that which is honorable is held dear, if for no other reason than because it is held honorable." Seneca claims that his peers were to regard honor as desirable as a virtue in and of itself. And so that's an example from the secular world. Another famous phrase from a gentleman named Isocrates says, "Honor and dishonor play a dominant part in our moral instruction." The phrase, "it is disgraceful," or "it is noble," appear much more often than the phrases right or wrong. And so nobility, honorable conduct, in public office and in private life, those were virtues embedded into the culture of Rome. So with that challenge comes the fear of being dishonored or dismembered or disconnected or being seen in a light that's negative by Roman culture and Roman society. To do something that was dishonorable or brought shame on the individual would also bring shame on their family. And this, of course, is a dominant force and a very powerful force in Jewish culture as well. And so you'll see these honor-shame rituals. And so the Jews in Jesus' time would express those in terms of clean and unclean, insiders and outsiders, right? Jews and Gentiles as an extension of honor and shame. But keeping Torah, staying clean, being in obedience to God, being a son or daughter of Abraham, all of this kind of framework is also an honor and shame framework. And these reinforce the connectedness of the community, and they reinforce that strong sense of belonging. And so that language of what is honorable and what is shameful, even more than what is good or bad or right or wrong, it's what will keep you in the good graces of the community, what will promote a view of you and your family that allows you access to the power and commerce of Roman culture, what prevents you from being an outsider, what enables you to do business and to conduct your affairs without reprisal is really your honor and your shame. And so, of course, for the Israelites, that was also going to be closely tied to their name or their clan or their tribe. And so we're familiar with this idea. When we say someone wants to have a good reputation, right, or someone wants to protect their name, or I want to protect my legacy. You know, as we get older in our lives, we begin to think more about those things. And so you'll see rituals like shunning, for example, in the Amish community here in our country, or disowning someone or cutting them out of a will. You know, these are different mechanisms that we use even here in modern culture as a way of expressing that someone has stepped outside of what we believe is honorable behavior. And so it's important that we read the Gospels with the backdrop of both the Roman and Jewish honor, shame culture. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some passages through that lens, and I think you'll see that it really does enhance your view of these texts when you think of honor and shame as that which kind of underpins some of these interactions that we're about to look at. What was a Jewish shaming style? You don't have to go much further than Luke chapter 15, the parable of the prodigal sons, to see how that all operated. So you'll recall on Luke 15 that there's a man and he has two sons, and of course the younger comes and asks for the share of the inheritance which he is given, and he goes off and he squanders it, on what is called wild living. Later, of course, he returns home to find himself not as an outsider, but to find himself accepted by his father and yet rejected by his brother. So if you begin to think about honor and shame, it helps us unpack the meaning of this parable and kind of what might be happening between the two parties. So for instance, the father is seen as the welcomer and someone who, in spite of the fact that his son has brought shame and disgrace on the family by living outside of the community, by operating outside the boundaries of what was clean, outside the boundaries of Torah, done violence to what was acceptable behavior, the father welcomes the son home, throws a party, kills the fattened calf, and basically treats him, even elevates him by giving him the signet ring and the sandals and the robe, that he really elevates the one who should have been shamed. And then it's actually the older brother who shuns, who stays away, who doesn't come into the house and doesn't engage with the family. And Jesus, of course, is using honor and shame in that parable to illustrate the point that when someone does what is shameful, God creates an opportunity to still love them, that God doesn't evaluate us the way we evaluate one another, and that mercy triumphs over judgment, and that shaming culture can be destroyed by a relationship with God the Father and Jesus the Son. And so as you begin to look at that parable, not just from a right or wrong or who got angry or who let him come home, or even just a straight up parable of grace, which of course it is, but there's an honor and shame narrative that's going on here underneath it that when we understand that really enhances the power of what the Father is actually doing. And it illustrates how caught up in culture the older brother really is, and how his heart has not been transformed, and he can't get beyond that honor-shame viewpoint that he sees in his younger brother because he's not looking at it through the eyes of the Father. Let's look at another passage that's incredibly familiar to us through this exact same lens. And you'll notice that I've deliberately chosen passages that are very, very familiar because we do tend to think of them as passages that we know and understand, but without the correct frame, sometimes we can misinterpret or miss important things. So in Matthew 18, very familiar to us, if your brother sins against you, verse 15, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Even here, what we see is there's honor and shame at work behind this, right? We have someone that's done something that's violated honor, that's violated shame and honor culture, that's violated the community in some way. The Bible here just calls it a sin. And that we are to first begin with a private conversation. Why a private conversation? Because it protects honor. It protects reputation, right? That what we do not do first is broadcast someone's mistakes all over the place, or talk about them in dark corners, or build a culture where we can feel good about ourselves. But we begin by going to the individual. And as long as I've been in the ministry, this continues to be something that is challenging for us to apply. Because we want to push that shame button because it helps us to feel better about the mistakes perhaps that we have made. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. And I think so often we go into these conversations thinking that the goal is to win the war, win the argument. But really, Jesus says here that it's a relational connection that we're trying to restore, that what I want to do is bring my brother back into a place of honor, back into a place of connection, back to the community. I want to restore that relationship as quickly as possible. I don't want to increase shame. I don't want to create more disconnection. And that it's only when that doesn't work that we begin to bring additional witnesses. And the text that's quoted here, every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. You know, that this is something that, again, is designed to restore honor to the community, right? That the testimony, the witness of another person is used not to get them, not to prompt shame, but to restore, right? And so built into this passage that we know very well is this insistence that honor must be restored, that shame must be reduced, and that reputations should always be carefully guarded and protected by a loving community. So another passage that's really illuminating is here in Galatians chapter 1, where the Apostle Paul is talking to the churches in Galatia, which of course isn't a place, it's a region. He's talking to this region of churches about the pressure that they're feeling to change the gospel. And he says, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion, trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preached to you, let him be eternally condemned. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let him be eternally condemned. Am I now trying to win the approval of men or of God? Am I trying to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. And then he goes on and he elaborates in verses 11 through 25 how God-centered his mission was. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preach is not something that man made up. I did not receive it from any man, he says in verse 12, but I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. And he talks about his reputation before he was in Christ, his previous way of life in Judaism, his persecuting of the church. Basically, he begins to read them his honorable Jewish resume. God set me apart from birth. He revealed his son to me. And I didn't consult any man. And all of these phrases, these are all honor, shame, trigger phrases, right? They are designed to remind the Galatians that Paul had a place of honor in the Jewish community. He abandoned that because the honor of Christ was more honorable, that serving the living God created greater honor even than all of the resume checking, the box checking, all of the honor and shame ladder rungs that he had climbed in Judaism, that being a disciple of Christ was in fact more honorable. And it is exactly that tension that Paul is feeling, and that's what the church here in Galatia, the churches, are feeling, this pressure from culture to change the gospel, to take some of the edge off it, to make it a little bit more culturally relevant, culturally acceptable. And there are a lot of ways that they might have been doing that, and we won't get into all the details. But this is an example of the pressure that Roman culture, that honor-shame culture, brings to bear on the life of the Christian and the life of the church, and it pushes them towards compromise. And so before we just simply look at this and go, oh yeah, they had some doctrinal confusion. Perhaps they did, but that was a reaction to honor and shame pressures that they were feeling, both from the Gentile population and a desire to be as relevant as possible and to create the least amount of offense and to maintain cultural standing and honor in their communities while still somehow walking the line of being a disciple of Christ. And Paul, of course, says, we cannot do that. We cannot do that. Finally, in verse 9 of chapter 2, we kind of come to a point where Paul begins to use this same argument in a relationship. And he says, James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. I do think it's very interesting that Paul he pushes the reputation button. He says, these are men that they've got reputations in the church. And their reputation, their honor, Paul is borrowing that. He's saying, they accepted me, why can't you accept me? People that you regard with high honor have given me the honor of a right hand of fellowship. You also should include me in your community. And so I know this is not a complete treatment of the epistle to the Galatians, but I hope that some of these examples give you a perspective on how it is that if we look at honor and shame and we read with an eye to that, it really explodes and expands our view of the real tensions that are coming on these Christians and the battle to maintain the honor of God in our hearts and not to give in or give way to the honor and shame culture that we see in the world around us. There's another significant lens that I want us to talk about, and that is the idea of what I'm calling kinship, purity, and pollution. Sometimes we call that clean and unclean. Kinship is a synonym, of course, for family, but kinship and purity rituals really test the loyalty of the early church and the New Testament times. The truth about purity is, that we all hate dirt. Nobody likes a dirty space. And in the New Testament, there's no exception. And so this is something that actually we understand a little bit better than we think we do. We tend to think of clean and unclean as a very New Testament paradigm, and yet most of us practice these same kinds of distinctions in our everyday life. For example, most of us don't walk into the shower eating a sandwich. Most of us don't cook our food in the garage. Most of us don't put a dirty plate in our bed before we go to bed at night. All of us make distinctions, right? Some families have the 30-second rule. Something falls on the ground, and how long is it before you can pick it up and eat it again? And we all have individual sensitivities around things that we consider to be acceptable or healthy or clean or unclean. Some of us, even that extends to the way we keep our homes. How often do we clean them? And do we move the sofa and vacuum behind it, Ed? Or, do we just leave the dog for kind of wherever it is, But what do we do? We have different ideas about what these things are. And almost all cultures universally have purity rituals or what we might call purity maps around things like sex and toilet. Where we do those activities tends to be in separate places from where we do the rest of our lives. So these ideas are also very connected to another idea, which is sacred space. And so, of course, in the Bible, when God touches a place or when God appears at a place, it instantly becomes a sacred place. And in fact, when something is touched by God or inhabited by God, we would say that it belongs to God, that it actually becomes claimed by God. So the burning bush is an Old Testament example, but of course the church or the heart of the Christian, a temple in the New Testament is an example of that, right? That the Holy of Holies, a place where God lives and dwells, belongs to God. And so this idea of purity and pollution and places where things belong or don't belong is embedded into New Testament culture as well, especially Jewish New Testament culture. So one of the clearest examples of how this helps us read a text is in John chapter 4. So let's turn over to John chapter 4 and let's read this passage with fresh eyes through the lens of purity and pollution, clean and unclean. Before we get further into this session, I want to just introduce what might be a little bit of a new concept or a new way of looking at something, but I want to talk about what I'm calling, and what David De Silva calls, a purity map. So a purity map is simply just a way of looking at different levels of access or cleanness and uncleanness. Of course, in Israel, we understand that pollution or contamination or even contagion, a good metaphor for these days, happens when a boundary line is crossed that shouldn't be crossed, right? So, for example, if a Levite or a priest went too close to a dead animal or a dead body, or if a skin disease happened on someone, right, that proximity to a place that we're not supposed to be can create a change in our status. We're crossing a boundary line in a map, and it changes our ability to be a part of the community or our access to God. And so you'll see place and location-based purity maps in ancient Israel. You'll also see maps of people, that there are different kinds of people, right? Israel is repeatedly called a holy people, the people belonging to God. And the Gentiles are in particular, and then the Samaritans also, were sort of outside that map, right? They practiced abominations. They did things that God had specifically told the Israelites not to do. Those created a defilement. So there are also groups of people that are mapped in a way that is outside of what would be called pure. And then, of course, the rite of circumcision took a person from not the people to the people, that it was a sign of the covenant. And of course, within Israel, there were also gradations of holiness based on, again, contact with certain things. Menstruation created a separation, different types of diseases, and then greater or lesser access to holy places and holy things in Israel was determined by this map. And sometimes those maps came about as the result of birthright, like a Levite or a priest. You were born into those families. And so that family lineage, that personal map, if you will, gave you instant access or different kinds of access to God. And then we know that in Leviticus 21, God dwelt in holy places in a very special kind of way. So the Jewish race itself was, in some sense, a holy place and a holy nation. And then, of course, there are maps of spaces, places in the Jewish world. Jerusalem, God's holy mountain, of course, the holy tent, the tent of meeting, any place where God stood or appeared, like we referred to earlier, any place where God would go, altars, places like that where God had been or altars had been erected, or there had been a vision, or God had stood and spoken to people. All of those places became also sacred space, and that place was protected, and you had to have a certain ability or a certain status to access that place. So the city that housed the temple, of course, Jerusalem, was considered a holy place. And anything outside of those holy places or outside of those maps, that the Israelites would have called that common, not just unholy, but common or ordinary or everyday. And then finally, there's the purity maps involve something around time. There are sacred times, sacred days, high holidays now we call them today. But the Sabbath, the seventh day, different things were set apart as holy. Holy seasons, times to leave the fields fallow and not let them grow. Sabbath years were instituted. And there are different types of ways in which time itself was set apart. And of course, this idea of mapping purity extended into every area of Israelite life. And so as you think about coming into the New Testament, a lot of those maps, those purity sensitivities and sensibilities are embedded in the way that the Israelites and the Jews of the New Testament times think about everything. People, where they can go, when they can go, what they eat. All of the Jewishness, in a sense, that we experience in the New Testament, it's all tied back indelibly to these purity rituals, purity maps, and these identifiers that had been established in Torah for centuries. And so we need to consider those things as we begin to interact with Jesus, and he begins to reach across those boundary lines and touch things that would have been unclean, or walk into spaces, or on his journeys go through lands that would have been prohibited by the geographic purity map of earlier times, or speak in a way, or invoke a power and a presence that would have been not allowed for him to do as a common person. So it's touch, it's food, it's location, all of these things. Jesus violated, at least from the Pharisees and Sadducees' perspective, he violated those maps all the time. And so as you read through your New Testament, it's important to think of those different boundary lines that Jesus is breaking and that he's crossing, and why that was so disturbing to the Israelites, and what it suggests about the power and the identity of Christ, but also what God is doing to those limitations and those boundaries in crossing them in the person of Jesus Christ. So in John chapter 2, the famous wedding at Cana. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had been invited to the wedding. And of course, we know the story, right? The wine runs out in verse 3. They come to him and they say, "We don't have any more wine." He has this interaction with his mother. And then the servants take this instruction from his mother to do whatever he tells them. Verse 6 says, "Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water.' So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet.' And they did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. He called the bridegroom aside and said, 'Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best for now.' This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him." Absolutely fantastic first miracle story, loaded with all kinds of ceremonial and sacerdotal imagery. But let's just take a look at this passage through this new lens of clean and unclean, pure and impure, and through what we'll call the purity map. So Jesus is at a wedding, right? The combination of 2 new families. And wedding imagery, which we don't have time to get into, but wedding imagery in the New Testament is also a synonym for the rejoining of man and God, or mankind and the spiritual world, right? There's a rejoining. But here Jesus comes across jugs of wine, and the text makes it clear that these were stone water jars used for ceremonial washing. So what are these jars from a purity and pollution perspective? They are jars that contain the means of going from a state of uncleanliness to a state of cleanness, from a state of outside to a state of inside, from a community or a relationship with God perspective, right? That maybe another way to say this is that when you washed at these jars, you went from a place of access or no access to access, right? That you had a change of spiritual status based on what you did with these jars. So these jars were a cleansing station, if you will, a place to go from unclean to clean. So Jesus uses those jars and he turns that water into wine. So he takes something that's supposed to hold unclean things, the dirt, the impure water that comes off of a man, and he turns that into something that a person would actually put inside of them, wine, that they would fill themselves with. So you have something that was filled with something impure, now it's filled with new wine, really good wine. And so when you begin to think about these things from a purity and impurity perspective, it gives you a little bit more of an enhanced view of what Jesus might be doing and what he might be getting at here. And so I won't spoil it all for you. You can do this work on your own, but I want you to think about a couple of things. What does it mean that Jesus' first miracle was performed at a wedding where there's the joining of 2 people, and he took something that had been associated with uncleanliness and he filled it with hope and he filled it with wine? What does it suggest that Jesus' very first miracle was repurposing something that had formerly been associated with uncleanness and impurity and made it something that we would actually take inside of us when we're celebrating 2 new lives coming together as one? And so I pose these questions because they're exactly the kinds of questions that a purity and pollution, clean and unclean, that kind of view should help us to ask when we read a passage like this. So thank you so much for tuning in to this session this afternoon, and just to want to kind of give a quick recap of the things that we discussed. The first is the idea of empire and kingdom, and the way Jesus and the gospel writers take great pains to make sure that it's crystal clear from the New Testament that Jesus is the only true king, that his message is the only true message, and that his kingdom is the only eternal kingdom. And in contrast to Rome, that spent time and energy building up the Caesars to be living gods, they are in fact only mere men, and Jesus is the King of Kings and the only true God and Son of God. Secondly, we talked about these structures of honor and shame. And we spent a lot of time talking about the way that God himself broke down our human constructions of what we think of as shameful behavior by sending Christ to be our shame, to be sin for us, as the Bible says. And that Jesus himself taught stories about God breaking down these social barriers, and that it's important for us as disciples to make sure that when we're helping one another or we're working through trying to build each other into the image of Christ, that we don't let shame and that we don't cause shame to get in the way of our relationships, and that shame is something that the Bible comes to get rid of, and that we need to build people into honorable people and treat our brothers and sisters with honor. And then finally, the idea around purity and pollution, clean and unclean. Once again, Jesus shatters our notions of what it means to be close to God. And I think we've illustrated today that understanding that Jesus came to break again another boundary between God and man, which is Jesus came to make all things clean. And we discussed in John 4 that the idea that these washing jars would have been washing on the outside of the body, but now Jesus is saying you can take this clean wine inside of you. And so we challenged you to think about the messaging of that and what it really means that Jesus came to make all things and all humans clean. I hope that these 3 vignettes have helped you to think a little bit more about culture and historical and cultural context and get the wheels turning, and that you'll enjoy these things well into the future as you study your Bible.